All right, there are 5 basic tenets of the nature of science. Tenets is another word for principles, so another way of saying this is that there are 5 basic principles to scientific knowledge. The first one is that all scientific knowledge is empirically based. Now, when you took biology, you should have learned the letter CONPTT, where C stood for consistent, O was observable, N is natural, P is predictable, and T is testable. And those 5 that I've highlighted in yellow all kind of fall within this principle of scientific knowledge being empirically based. So all scientific knowledge is testable, and it is based on observable evidence. That evidence is derived from experiments and observations of the natural world. When we use that word observation, that is the process through which the basic facts of science are acquired. So when you do an observation, it has to be made directly with the 5 senses. So taste, touch, seeing, smelling, hearing. Those observations can be made directly with instruments. So you could use like a microscope to see something that's too small to see with the naked eye. You could use a voltmeter to measure electric current that you would not necessarily be able to detect with your sense of touch. You may also utilize measuring devices, so meter sticks and clocks. And then observations come in 2 types. They may be qualitative, which uses descriptions, so you might say that something is red, or yellow, or big, or small, or light, or heavy. And observations can also be quantitative, and those are anything that have some sort of numerical measurement. 50 pounds, 3 grams, 20 seconds, anything that's got a number on it is quantitative. Scientific knowledge is also tentative and changing. So again, going back to biology, you have CONPTT. That last T stood for tentative, and all scientific knowledge is tentative and changing. The change in the knowledge that we have is inevitable, because as science tests and challenge previous assumptions and previous findings and previous knowledge, they're always coming up with new evidence, especially as technology improves. One of the neat things about science is that science is a self-correcting process, so we don't state something and assume that it's going to be true forever and ever and ever. We're continually weeding out errors of thought, we're continually weeding out errors in methodology, in other words, how we do an experiment, and making improvements, and so that range where the truth may reside continues to get narrower and narrower, and we can never be 100% certain that what we understand is exactly true, but we can get closer and closer and closer to where we think that truth resides. Number 3, everything in science is subjective. Again, this is one that is difficult to understand because you think that science is not subjective. You think that science is objective. Right? But because we are humans, doing science is a human experience, everything in science is subjective. So you have personal biases, your sex, whether you're male or female, your age, your values, your agendas, any experiences that you've had in your life, including like other research that you may have done in the past, your cultural background. And cultural background could be like your nationality, your ethnic origin, your political convictions, like whether you're Democratic leaning or Republican leaning. All of those affect the way you view the world. So all of these may influence the direction of scientific research, including the types of questions that you might ask, the types of evidence that you might decide to collect, as well as how you interpret that evidence. 2 different people presented with the exact same evidence could arrive at 2 different conclusions because, again, they are subjective in the way they analyze that data. 4th one, scientific knowledge is invented and created. You don't really make discoveries in science, which is kind of hard to wrap your head around. Rather, what we do is we kind of invent scientific knowledge. We create this kind of image of how we think the natural world works. Again, we can't be certain of it, right? It's just our understanding based on the evidence that we have. And there's a lot of imagination and creativity that goes into developing this knowledge. So we create hypotheses, we design experiments, we make inferences, we summarize data, we develop theories. All of this stuff takes a lot of imagination and creativity in order to invent how we interpret the natural world to work. And then that word inference, when we talk about scientists making inferences. An inference is the act of drawing a conclusion based on observations and previous knowledge. So you have to have a whole bunch of observations first, and then you look at those observations and you kind of create a conclusion based on those observations, and that conclusion is called an inference. If you remember from biology, many of you might have worked with these little cubes, and the cubes had names on them, like Alba and Albert, Rob and Roberta, Frank, and then you didn't know what the other name was. Some of you might have guessed that it was Francesca, some might have guessed Francis, but you had to draw a conclusion based on the association between male and female names, the number of letters in the name, how many letters those names had in common, and that was the inference that you drew, the conclusion that you drew of what you thought was on the bottom of that cube. The last tenet or principle of scientific knowledge is that it involves social negotiation. So the development of scientific knowledge depends on communication amongst scientists. So you might have one person coming up with one piece of knowledge, and then they go and they publish that in a journal, and then somebody else reads it, and they build on that knowledge, and now you have a third person that comes in and reads these two other journal articles and builds on that, or maybe the three scientists begin to collaborate and work together. But you always have communication among scientists, whether they're working together or whether they're just building on previous knowledge that was published before them. Knowledge acquires credibility when it's recognized by other scientists. When a scientist publishes and makes their knowledge available for other scientists to read, if that second scientist can duplicate the experiment or verify the claims, then that makes that knowledge or that information, that data and evidence more credible. And lastly, scientists agree upon common ways of conducting research. There are phrases like facts and hypotheses and theories and laws that scientists agree on what those mean and how we use them. They also have common ways of conducting research. So there are different ways of collecting that information. There are experiments where you have a hypothesis and then you test that hypothesis. There's also a way of compiling knowledge where you make a whole bunch of observations and then you kind of analyze and find patterns in those observations and come up with a hypothesis on the end. Again, kind of like the cubes with the names on them. You made a whole bunch of different observations and then you hypothesized what you thought was on the bottom. And that hypothesis was, again, your inference based on observation.